Good morning, everybody. How we doing?
Good morning.
Good morning. You all look bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, whatever the heck that means. All right, who are we missing here? Okay, well, I think we get started. We're recording anyway. So we got your exam this week, and hopefully you got the email message that I had posted something on iLearn that will give you a sense of the format of the exam, the different parts, what the different parts are worth, and the time. I should mention that the exam is absolutely designed for you to finish in 3 hours, but I remember the last couple of years, people wanted a little more time, and that's perfectly fine. You can take up to 4 hours, but do not think that you need to take up to 4 hours. If you can finish in 3 hours, that's perfectly fine. I just don't want anyone to feel rushed. So don't feel like you need to fill up more space to, fill in 4 hours. Okay, so it's no problem if you want to take a little time, but don't feel compelled to take more time. Okay. So what did we talk about? We talked about me.
I have a quick question before we move
Go
on.
ahead, Hunter.
If you had suggested like 1 to 2 sentences for some of the answers, if for some reason we write 4, that's not going to be like
perfectly fine.
Okay.
I'm just giving you a sense of what probably how much you'll need to answer the question fully. But if you write more, that's no problem. No one's going to get points dinged off for writing too much. I'm just looking for kind of key ideas in each of the answers. So as long as you convey those ideas, you'll be fine. I should tell you that it is pretty comprehensive. It is mostly based on lecture, but some of the readings can certainly help fill in details, maybe make your answers more sophisticated. But if you understand the lectures well, then you should do fine. This is the sort of test where it does help to study together. And so, let's talk about when you're going to get it. I could send it as early as tonight. Do people planning on taking it like early this week, tomorrow, or something like that? Or yeah, okay. So I can send it tonight if you want. And then I guess you can have it back to me by Monday early morning. Let's say Monday at 9 is fine. That gives you all weekend to finish it. The only concern there would be if you needed your midterm grade sooner. Of course, this is week 6, correct? So you wouldn't get your midterm grade until week 7. And usually graduate students don't worry about that too much. Undergraduates have deadlines where they have to change their grading option and stuff, but I don't think that really pertains to you folks. So that's no problem. Just, study as long as you want. And then when you're ready to take the exam, put your books away and all your notes and sit down and take the exam. You'll see there's a little declaration to sign there saying that, you did a closed book exam and, you did it by yourself. And I never used to include that in the exam, but a few years ago there was an issue. So I'm just asking for, people to be on their honor when they do this. And that's why we have the little signature there. But, you all have very trustworthy faces, so I'm sure there's nothing to worry about. All right. Other questions on the exam? No? Yeah. Morgan, I was just telling them before you got on that I have given you 4 hours to take the exam, but it really is designed to finish in 3. And the reason I give you the extra hours, I don't want you to feel forced to finish. I don't want you to feel rushed, but I think that you can easily finish in 3 without a problem. So don't feel compelled to write more just because you have an extra hour. Okay.
Thank you.
Anything else? Okay. And yeah, studying together for a test like this makes a lot of sense. And, you have at least, those of you that are going to wait to take it later in the week, you have some days to do that together. And the reason why I think it really helps is because it's conceptual material. A lot of it's kind of touching on philosophy. And that sort of material is easy to think you understand until you try explaining it to each other. And I can't remember if we mentioned this in this class. There's some great, kind of very famous studies that show that if you are understanding something well enough to explain it to somebody else, you'll do better on a test than if you're studying for a test, right? Did we talk about this? I can't remember. Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah. I'm a firm believer in it. Long before these studies were actually done, I would always tell my graduate courses, this is stuff you need to be able to explain to each other. You need to be able to explain to lay persons, your family, and that sort of thing. You need to understand these concepts in your own words to the extent that you could teach it to anybody. And so, that's studying together is a good way of kind of doing that. As long as when you're the audience for the person who's trying to teach it, you act naive and push the person on their understanding. It really, really helps. And, for this type of test, a lot of folks I know when they come into grad school, they aren't used to taking this type of test in that it's very, very conceptual. You can't just pass it by memorizing. You really have to understand it in your own words, your own language, and that's something that studying together very often helps with. Okay. All right. Anything else? Beautiful fall day here. It's cold here. Is it cold in Riverside? Yeah, it's 50. I woke up, it was 45 degrees when I was walking the dog. That's nuts. That's not what we paid for to be in California, right? All right. My son is coming home from Wisconsin on Saturday, and it's in the 70s there right now. So I'm hoping he brings the warm weather with him from Wisconsin. Okay. Let's go ahead and start where we left off then. All right. There I am. And we were talking about Sofia Vergara. Let me get all this set up here. There I am. So let's kind of get a big picture here. We're talking about a computational approach in general. We're going to come back and address that directly in just a few minutes. But the way we got into this more specific domain of imitation and mirror neurons is that we kind of looked, well, we took a long road, but a long and an exciting road, if you ask me. What we did is we looked at, kind of one of the core concepts of the computational approach, modularity. And modularity, we kind of discussed it as it was kind of formalized in the 80s and 90s, but again, all those kind of themes do arise in modern theory. So we will come back to that as we get more modern. But as we were talking about modularity, we discussed the idea of kind of speech being a prototypic example of modularity. And we looked deep into the speech module in the sense of what type of functional specialization it had. And we found that it was a system that could actually make use of the fact that speech is produced. So we had this kind of very important connection between perception and production that was kind of exemplified in the speech module. And from that idea, the notion that perception and production are very closely linked, we saw a much more modern example of that in the mirror neuron story. So the mirror neuron story is that there are sets of cells that seem to be dedicated to not only kind of initiating certain actions, but also perceiving those actions in others performing them, whether they're other people or other monkeys, as we were discussing the origins of the mirror neuron story. And so that got us into the notion that imitation is something that we're all doing all the time. And it might facilitate not just our social interactions, but it actually might facilitate things at a very fundamental level, at the perceptual level. And we'll be talking about that in just a second. But that brings us back to the speech story, and I'll discuss that in this slide, and then back to modularity and back to a computational approach in general. So that just kind of brings us deep into the a computational sort of perspective. So, I mean, in a sense, we're still talking about a computational perspective as we discuss mirror neurons and that sort of stuff. But it's certainly kind of going into a very specific example of it, and how that specific example has branched out and influenced theories of perception and cognition in general, with regard to kind of this inadvertent imitation we're all doing that seems to facilitate our cognitive skill. Okay, so we left off on this example. Let me see, what did I talk about here? So we talked last class about kind of the social, psychological ramifications of this imitation, and clearly shows some important influences over how we experience others during our social interaction, and how we experience the social interaction itself in terms of its success and likelihood of producing positive results and all that sort of fun stuff. But now we're going to talk more about the kind of the perceptual ramifications of this. So we were talking about the fact that we all do imitation as we're speaking to each other, and we are known to imitate our accent and our rate and our intonation. Intonation is just the melody of speech. And you sometimes are aware of this. I think I mentioned that we have just initiated a project to kind of address this embarrassing occurrence that happens as we're talking to somebody with a thick accent. So I'm sure if I ever met Sofia Vergara and I was talking to her, I would probably do that embarrassing imitation of her accent. And the question is, should it be as embarrassing as we feel it is? In other words, do you think Sofia Vergara would notice when I imitated her accent? And I have some research in this domain of inadvertent imitation, and every once in a while I'll get asked by the press, when we do this, do the other folks notice it? Do the folks with the accent notice it? And my intuition is they might not. And that's something we're studying right now. Do people with accents notice when others that don't have accents that's the same as theirs, do they notice when they're imitated? And my intuition is no, but we're now going to be studying that in our lab. So I'll keep you posted on that. But what we know is that it happens even when we don't make those very kind of conspicuous, instances of it where we are aware of ourselves imitating an accent. It's happening all the time. And it does happen along all those dimensions that are listed there. It also occurs, interestingly, not just when we are interacting with somebody, but it also occurs just very simply when we're listening to recorded speech. And that's how we do it in my lab. We ask people to put on headphones and listen to words or listen to sentences and just say those sentences or words out loud. So there's no social interaction really involved in that case. In that case, they're just saying, they're doing a very simple sort of action, which is just to say the words they're hearing, or hearing and seeing, as we do it in our lab, out loud. And what we find is, yeah, absolutely, in those contexts, people will still do imitation. And in our case, and in most of the cases that are studied, it's not listening to people with accents, it's listening to native English speakers and asking native English speakers to say those words out loud, and they will show an imitative tendency. So certainly, the social aspects of this do probably facilitate the degree to which this imitation occurs, but it's not necessary. And the fact that it happens even outside of social contexts is interesting. Oh, one more thing I think I mentioned last time is that this happens with speech recognition computers. So in principle, if you're having some interaction with Siri, I think most of my interactions with Siri are asking it to dictate or just giving it one command. But if Siri asks me a question back, sometimes it has me refine what I'm saying or something like that. There is evidence that Ollie will do the imitation of Siri even in that context, where I certainly know, at least consciously, that I'm interacting not with a person, but a machine that has no social connection to me. But I can't help but do that little imitation. Again, the imitations we're talking about here are very subtle. It's not the conspicuous imitating the accent sort of thing, but it is something that is noticeable by other people, potentially. In fact, that's very often how it's measured. People, raters are asked to say whether my utterance after speaking with Siri is more like Siri than an utterance that I produced without speaking to Siri. And yeah, they'll be able to tell, oh yeah, that sounds more like Siri in that case, right? So it is something that is perceptible, even though I probably have no awareness of doing it. And, it's much more subtle than the sort of accent imitation we were talking about before. So the fact that it happens outside of social context has been interesting to people, because what it suggests is that maybe it, yes, has something to do with social interaction. And again, social interaction might heighten the degree of imitation that goes on. But what the imitation might suggest is something maybe more fundamental. And it does call back to the motor theory of speech perception, the idea that there is this link between perception and production. So we'll talk about this again in a second, but I just wanted to kind of whet your appetite so you understand we're talking about something that's kind of very fundamental in perception and cognition, not something that's social psychology. Imagine I'm speaking with Siri. Okay, I'll stay with Siri. That's fine. And in order to understand Siri like I understand anybody, potentially what I'm doing is I'm making use of my motor system, right? My internal motor system. And we've discussed the fact that there seems to be some evidence for this, at least in some context where, the motor system seems to be primed as I'm perceiving speech. We talked about that last class as we were discussing, the neurophysiology research on that. There's a ton now. So I listened to Siri say, I don't know, a word, timer. I said a timer a lot with Siri. And Siri says timer, and then I say timer back. Or to understand Siri saying timer, I have to, go through this process that, because the speech input is so degraded even by Siri's quote core articulation, in order to decipher it, I make use of my motor system, my speech motor system, to disentangle the effects of Siri or anybody's co-articulation. So the motors, I kind of do this internal NASA simulation of what could have produced that signal as it came in, based on what I know of production and how production kind of creates this co-articulatory mess that occurs. So I make use of my production system, and if then I am asked to say the word I heard immediately, my production system is primed by the percept I just had. So Siri, specific perception, in other words. And in other words, my production system was just kind of primed to analyze Siri's speech, so that if I say the word, my production system still has kind of the remnants of what it needed to do in order to help the perception of Siri, which then produces speech that sounds like Siri. Maybe Siri is not a great example. Let's talk about Sofia Vergara, very thick accent. So I'm thinking of examples from the TV show. I remember this, my family and I used to watch the show Modern Family. There's this very, very funny scene where it's the dad's birthday, it's her husband's birthday, and she gets him for the birthday a phone that is a telephone that has like sexy red lips. It's made out of sexy red lips. It's kind of like these really kind of garish looking telephone, like the type that you'd have at home, where you pick up the lips and talk on the lips. And she says, you asked for a sexy phone. And he said, well, I asked for a saxophone, but this will do fine. And so there's the accent, phone. So she says phone, and I'm trying to perceive it, and that's a little tricky. So my production system comes into play, to help me understand her speech. And then if I have to say phone back to her, right, like we're trading phone numbers or something like that, if I have to say phone back to her, because my production system was just primed with her speech, my speech production of that same word will likely be shaped by her speech. Okay, so we're talking about, not something that's just a social phenomenon. We're talking about something very deep, where the involvement of production in perception for language is what it provides the basis of imitation. okay? And potentially that could work with everything. Anytime we see evidence of some type of imitation between people as they're interacting, okay, it might say something about how perception is aided by the production system. Okay, and that's important. That's a very important notion because we're going to see it everywhere. I mean, imitation seems to occur in almost all social contexts, and even in these non-social contexts that probably, are remnants of the social context. Okay, so what we're talking about here is speech convergence or speech alignment. You see both of those terms in the literature. I think I use the term convergence mostly now. But it is the fact that we're doing imitation of each other, and interestingly, it's not just kind of those global sort of dimensions of intonation, the melody of a sentence, syntax, the ordering of the words, or even words itself. It seems to actually act on a very low level aspect of speech, which is the phoneme level, the level of segments. So you can measure things such as the way vowels are strung into consonants, and we do that differently. We each kind of have an idiosyncratic way of stringing our vowels into consonants, which is interesting. So basically, what I'm talking about here is my co-articulatory style is different from other people's co-articulatory style, and that seems to be something that's imitated by other folks. So now we're not even talking about accent or dialect or anything like that. We're talking about kind of the very specific idiosyncratic ways an individual speaks and how that is imitated. So again, we all produce vowels and consonants, and there are things that they can recognize. But again, we blend our vowels into consonants, into vowels as we co-articulate, and each of us have a different co-articulatory style. And that is to some degree imitated by other people, which is really interesting. Other things, vowel space, and it's not important to understand the linguistic kind of details of this, but as we're producing vowels in e, u, ah, all those sort of things, depending on where we're from, depending on our articulatory tract and its general anatomy, we all produce vowels a little bit differently from each other. And that is also something that is subtly imitated. Now, let me say a little bit about this imitation. Again, the imitation we're talking about is never or rarely as conspicuous as the saxophone imitation I might do with Sofia Vergara, right? We're talking about kind of movements of the way I speak to the way you speak, kind of subtle kind of changes. So it's never a complete imitation. If it is, it gets very distracting, right? It's kind of, I'll produce vowels not exactly how you're producing them, but more like how you're producing them than I would produce them on my own. My vowels are kind of shifted. If you say E, well, let's think about it. Oh, yeah. So if you're from Minnesota, for example, and you say, oh, geez, oh, I don't usually say ohs like that. But if I were talking with you, my ohs might be a little bit more like your oh from Minnesota, okay? So there is this kind of shift in the direction of the way you're speaking, all right? And then this is what blew my mind. This is why I got into this. I just thought this was absolutely fascinating. We're not just talking about movements towards your style of phonemes as we're interacting. It's movements of the features of those phonemes. So remember, we're talking about features of phonemes. And this is kind of a nice time to kind of look at the big picture here when we were discussing feature detection or feature analysis. As we were discussing the computational approach, we discussed it as being able to recognize the various features of letters, right? The slant and the R. And then when we were talking about speech perception, we looked for the features and we started talking about, formant transitions, all that sort of stuff, right? Well, here's another important feature of speech that we didn't mention, but it's the same type of thing as the formant transitions. And it's called voice onset time. And I like to talk about this one because I think it's a very intuitive sort of feature, but it is kind of like it is a feature of speech that we believe has relevance to how speech is perceived and how speech is produced. By the way, somebody, I think one of you have your microphone on, and it doesn't really bother me that much, but just a little concerned that it's being picked up on the recording and it might bother other folks. Thank you. Anyway, what's voice onset time? What's voice onset time? Voice onset time is something actually very intuitive, and it's actually being portrayed here in this figure. So let's think of the distinction between ba and pa. B and P, okay, in the context of ah, as it shows it in that figure on the bottom right, okay. One of the things that distinguishes a ba from a pa is the relationship between when my lips part and the vocal folds start vibrating. When I make a ba, and you can actually feel down here if you want, ba, ba, you might notice that your vocal cords start vibrating just before your lips part. Ba. If you do it very slowly, you can exaggerate it, you can kind of feel that. Ba, ba. I can feel them down here, like you're almost humming at first. Ba. So that's when the vocal folds start vibrating. And that's what this is showing here. So it's just so we're reading this. This is showing lip closure. So the lips are closed as time goes on here, and then they part here. So this is when your lips pull apart. And this is the voicing, which is just another way of saying this is when the vocal cords are vibrating. Okay. So for ba, as you can see, your little vocal cords start vibrating right before your lips part. Ba, ba. You can feel that. You're kind of humming if you go do it very slowly and exaggerated. Ba, right? For pa, it's opposite. For pa, your lips part first before your vocal cords start vibrating. Pa, pa. Now, okay, what happens before your vocal cords vibrating, here I'm going to teach you a little speech anatomy here. Here's your little vocal cords. Here they are closed and vibrating, okay? And that's how you get them to vibrate. You close them like that. But before they vibrate, okay, they're open like this. And when you produce a pa, you force air to go between your open vocal cords. Can you see this okay? Yeah, your open vocal cords. And it goes through unencumbered. It goes through without the kind of catching of the vocal cords so they can vibrate. So it's pa, and then they close for the vibration. So that when you make a pa, you feel that puff of air in front of your mouth? Pa, which is the air going through your lungs, through your open vocal cords, out your mouth. Pa. You don't feel that for ba because the vocal cords catch the air and kind of use them to set them into vibration. And so there's no kind of puff of air that goes through your vocal cords in your mouth. So ba, you don't feel the vibration. Pa, you do feel the vibration. Okay? And that's just because of the timing relationship between when the vocal folds start vibrating, okay, and when the lips open. So here's pa. As you can see, it's a very brief amount of time, tiny, tiny. We're talking about 20 milliseconds or something like that. And your lips release, and then your vocal cords start vibrating. For ba, this is actually even more than usual. Usually the vibration starts right before the lips are released, but it kind of is, it's a schematic showing you that your vocal cords start vibrating before your lips are released. For ba, your vocal cords start vibrating just after your lips are released for pa. Now, if you're, I don't know, if you're from, England, you might have a longer delay between when the lips are released and when your vocal cords start vibrating. So sometimes, it's from certain kind of ritzy parts of England, you might say posh, like that. Like, my favorite singer is Posh Spice, okay? And so when you say that, what you're doing is you're really delaying, you're really exaggerating that delay between when the lips part and the vocal cords start vibrating. Posh Spice. There you go, posh. And that's what this is showing here, that there is, some variability in how much of a delay there is for the voice onset time after the lips part. So that's what we're talking about here. How much of a delay, what's the relationship between when the vocal cords start vibrating, the voice onset time, and the lips parting? That's what we're talking about. And that is a kind of a physical difference that occurs in articulation and is reflected very readily in the acoustic signal. Okay, so I think I almost did this when this is kind of like what I did say stay. Remember I did that categorical perception example. I think I did that example in the class. That also was kind of a voice onset time sort of thing, just to give you a sense. And you saw that there was a kind of a little silence there, no vibrations, or there might have been a little white noise for stay, but it looked. Remember, I added silence to kind of make say into stay to get that continuum. You can do the exact same thing by adding silence to a ba syllable. You can make it sound like a pa syllable by adding silence. It's the same exact idea. Okay, so this is something that can be measured when people are interacting with each other. Okay, and what you find is something very interesting. You find that people will shift their voice onset time to move towards the voice onset time that the other person uses. And I should mention, this is not just an interactive thing. This will work in the context of somebody with headphones on just listening to words. We've done this many times in our lab where we have people listen to words that are distinct, that have these pa syllables in the beginning of them, and we'll have them first say the words on their own, without listening to them. So it's we'll kind of, I guess, assume that's their natural way of speaking. So posh, paper, pencil, all these words. And then listen to other people's words and just say the words out loud, never asked to imitate, never asked to repeat. And what you'll find is they will shift their voice onset time just a tiny bit to where the speech they've heard has their voice onset time. And so this is a really, really microscopic sort of shift. We call this the microstructure of speech. And we're talking about shifts of 5 to 10 milliseconds, tiny, tiny little shifts here. And certainly shifts that are well beyond our conscious control of our articulators. I mean, I could not tell you to shift your voice onset time 5 milliseconds and you'd be able to do it. But your vocal tract, your speech production brain seems to do it inadvertently at such a precise level that it's beyond our what we say willful or conscious control. That's kind of what got me into this. Oh my gosh, this is amazing. So like our unconscious speech production brain is able to kind of modulate this imitation at a more kind of microscopic scale than we ever could think about doing willfully or consciously or anything like that. And there's tons of examples. It's very simple to do with this technique in the laboratory, which is called speech shadowing. So I'll put that. This is shadowing of recorded speech, but it also happens if you return to your native dialect, which many of you might do, during the Thanksgiving break or a holiday break. And depending on how different it is from the dialect you're experiencing now, and maybe this isn't currently the best example because we're not interacting with people as we usually do, but the example I typically give is, if you're from Minnesota and you're here in Riverside in Southern California for the first 3 months, and then you go back to Minnesota, your, kind of movement of, the way you're producing phonemes will kind of shift back towards Minnesota dialect. Right, and that's not just true of vowels, as I gave the example before, but it's also true of voice onset time sort of shifts, which also are distinguished very often between dialects. And it says shadowing recorded speech there because that's the name we give the task where we ask subjects to say words out loud that they're hearing. Our own research, just as an aside, and I will cover this a little bit later, our own research looks at the integration of auditory and visual speech and how that has a bearing on our inadvertent speech convergence to other people. We'll talk about that later, but it is a really, really interesting phenomenon. It's got this voice onset time has been replicated again and again, and you can see these systematic shifts that people have no idea they're doing. As you'll see, it is influenced by visual speech as well as auditory speech, and it is at the level of the microstructure. It is not. I mean, it is something that is actually difficult for outside perceivers to hear. It is, though, one of those features that is very easy to measure, and you see systematic shifts in how people speak. So the fact that this happens outside of social context, the fact that it happens at such a kind of low level is, I think, really telling about the fact that this is, yes, it might have some social ramifications. It might be enhanced by social situations or suppressed in other social situations, but its basis is probably more fundamental. And that's certainly the sort of thing that the speech theory we discussed, the motor theory of speech perception, would suggest. Again, like I said in the beginning of the slide, it seems that the speech perception system is somehow contacting the speech motor system, possibly to help it out. Okay, we said that might be a little controversial these days, but okay, it could be there to help out perception, at least in some cases, but it seems to prime the speech production system so that when you have to say the word that you just perceived, the production mechanism incorporates the details of how that word was saying and induces this inadvertent imitation. Okay, so I guess you could say speech imitation, speech mirror neuron sorts of observations are pretty nicely supportive of this interaction between speech perception and speech production that seems to happen naturally, reflexively, and automatically, possibly within a speech module. Okay, so this is in some ways a nice story because it kind of brings together everything we've been talking about in the last couple of lectures. You know, kind of brings together this mirror neuron story. It brings together the speech theory, the motor theory of speech perception, which is related to modularity, and as a kind of a prime example of a computational approach. Okay, I've got a couple more slides on this, on inadvertent imitation, but let me take a tiny bit of a break here and see if there's any questions about speech convergence or speech alignment as kind of a means to understand the convergence, the interaction of all these different concepts.
Yeah, I have a quick question.
Yes.
So the voice onset time there.
Yeah.
You're talking about it often in a kind of cultural context, but does it vary between people within a culture as
Absolutely.
well?
Yeah. I should have maybe said that in a little bit more detail. Yes. Even people within the same dialect, even people that brought up in the same family, have subtly different voice onset times, and you'll find that those, if then people are shadowing speech produced by somebody in their immediate dialect, they will shift to what's heard. So we all produce our voice onset times a little bit differently. The only difference, by the way, the only exception to that, by the way, and I've always found this really interesting, and I don't know where the literature stands on this, is that you find that identical twins will have pretty closely matching voice onset times. And I don't know if you've ever been friends with identical twins, but I've known a few in my life, and what I've always been struck by the fact that even if I get to the point where I can tell them apart, and very often they'll dress differently or they'll have different haircuts or something like that. They don't try going through college. They don't try to continue to look like each other. What still absolutely confounds me and absolutely confounds their parents, the research suggests, is how similar their voices are. They can easily fool people as pretending to be one another over the phone. It's very common. So that's kind of an interesting kind of exception, but it suggests that there's something in the the genetics that constrains the way their vocal apparatus has developed And especially if they're developed in the same household, they really have very similar idiosyncratic ways of idiosyncratic relative to the rest of the world ways of articulating, and that is measurable in voice onset time, which I think is really interesting. But other than that, siblings have different voice onset times from each other. Fraternal twins, non-identical twins have different voice onset times from each other. And when they interact, you will see these kind of really wild little shifts, tiny little microsecond shifts towards each other, which is just so cool in my opinion. Other questions?
So for the speech alignment, I mean, both sides are changing their features, right?
Yes. Well, let me just say very quickly, and the degree to which one person aligns more than the other, that can be influenced by kind of social context. But yes, you do see that both shift at least to some degree.
I think you've answered my question.
Okay. Yeah. And it's really interesting, because I've been in this world for probably 10 years now. In the speech alignment world, I've been, it's not our main line of research, but I've been really interested in it. And we just have a couple of papers coming out on it now. It is influenced by social context, but in I would have to say, a less clean way than one would hope. So you do find gender differences, but those gender differences aren't always consistent. You find differences in if two people are interacting. Doing a task together. Most often, it's the instruction giver who does a little bit more alignment than the instruction receiver, but even that can change. So, I have lots of colleagues that are studying the kind of social influences on speech alignment, and it can be a frustrating field. And it's we always have to, as we write about it in our papers, which have very little to do with the social context, we have to say that the jury's still out on how the social context is, kind of overlaid upon this, what I think is kind of a reflexive phenomenon that can be seen to existing to varying degrees as the social context is kind of superimposed on it, but it's not that clean a story, unfortunately. As long as we're talking about it, I'll just say that a couple of papers, but one paper that I think is going to be really exciting that we're about to submit has shown that there's been lots of questions about what the purpose of speech alignment is. I mean, is it just a byproduct of maybe involving the speech production system? And some people have argued about that. That yeah, it is. Maybe it's just that it's kind of a kind of a something that falls out, kind of a, what do you call it? Artifact of the fact that the speech production system is tied to the speech perception system. So if in fact you ask somebody to say a word that they've just heard, their speech production system will in fact incorporate the kind of idiosyncratic details of the word that was just heard. But the fact that it can be modulated by social context suggests that maybe there was a kind of a higher level influence. So maybe the ultimate basis for alignment is in the speech production perception connection. But since it's occurring, maybe social, kind of interaction can make use of it and help with alignment. Maybe it can help the interaction be more productive, or help people like each other, or help them feel like they have more in common, or something like that. And we know that's true of that other type of imitation we were talking about before, which is the body language imitation. You remember stroking the beards, all that sort of stuff. But the speech alignment stuff, which is that seems like it's more microscopic in some ways, that also could be something that facilitates social interaction. That's still a really complicated story. I'm not sure that we've got strong evidence for that. That being said, what we have recently been able to observe is that, this is pretty cool, I think, when somebody imitates your speech, okay, so, say you and I are just speaking and you're doing imitation of my speech, it is perceptually easier for me to actually understand your speech. Okay, so because you're talking a little bit more like me, if you then take your speech and put it in a background of noise, it's easier for me to understand than if I heard somebody else's speech who was not imitating me. So the imitation might not just, facilitate social interactions. It might actually facilitate comprehension on the person who's been for the person who's been imitated. That's what we've recently found and are writing up right now. So I think that'd be really interesting, and it kind of makes sense, and it actually ties into our next slide. We believe that this imitation stuff might facilitate perception. Remember, we talked a tiny bit about this as we were discussing facial expression. If somebody is constrained as they're looking at different facial expressions, so that they cannot do that kind of low-level imitative expression themselves, then they are a little bit worse at perceiving the expression of another person, right? So imitation in that context seems to facilitate perception, and that might also be the case for speech alignment. Okay, hopefully the result will hold up and all that. Okay, other questions on speech alignment before we go on? It's pretty cool set of phenomenon. It's flashy. People like it. It makes a lot of noise in the press, which is always fun. Okay, so let's talk about this now. So this is a nice little transition. So we've already talked a little bit about the fact that imitation seems to facilitate perception, and I'll remind us of that in just a second. But let's talk about some other examples, just so we get a sense of kind of the big picture here. We probably have some intuitions about this, and certainly if you were, somebody who is currently learning a sport or a musical instrument, you might realize that, as you're learning a new sport or instrument, and a lot of this learning does come from imitation, especially as you're first learning it. What happens is you become more sensitive to perceiving the sport or listening to the music, right? So, if you're learning to play basketball, like, my 17-year-old is learning different things in soccer right now. And, as he learns different moves, different ways of controlling the ball, all that sort of stuff, as he, a lot of this comes through imitation of watching the coaches do it, that sort of thing. When it comes time for him to watch soccer on TV, which he does, he is able to watch all the games out of England and Europe. He certainly is able to notice when those players are now performing that kind of trick with their ball control and that sort of thing. So certainly, I think we have intuitions about this, that imitative practice can help us perceive more. And the same with music. I have been playing music all my life, and sometimes I'll just decide to take up a new instrument just for fun. If I could show you all the instruments that are hanging around my garage right now, you'll get a sense of that. Sometimes I just thought it'd be fun to learn these things. And so for example, the last thing I tried to learn was sitar. You know what sitar is? It's that Indian instrument. And I thought it was going to be fairly like guitar, which I've been playing all my life, but it's really different in a lot of ways. You do, kind of the goal is different in terms of the sounds you're trying to make and what the technique is with the left hand on the fingerboard and all that sort of stuff. And so I took a couple lessons and I said, wow, this is really hard. I don't think you can do this without being serious. But certainly, after those lessons, I was able then to listen to other people playing sitar, professionals. Ravi Shankar played sitar, and I was able to hear techniques I was unable to hear before, and that comes from imitative practice. So those are all anecdotal. We all have some experience of that, and maybe you have something else besides sports and music that you've realized you've become a better perceiver of something as a kind of outcome of the practice you physically have done that was based on imitating your teacher or something like that. So those are fun anecdotes. But there's lots of experiments on this too to show that this is something that can be done. So this is, I like this experiment because it's it's kind of a skill that makes no sense and nobody would ever want, but still kind of shows that imitative practice can help perception. The experiment is like this. Subjects are sitting in a chair and they are taught to basically do a dance with their arms. Something like this. So they're watching the teacher. The teacher is an experimenter that's teaching this weird arm dance. So it's something like this. Something like that. Well, let me see if I can do it. Yeah, it's kind of more like this. And, you know, the only thing I wanted to point out to you as I'm doing it now is that it's not in phase, the coordination, nor is it completely out of phase like this. The arm dance is kind of somewhere in between. So this arm starts my right arm will start moving before my left hand is all the way back, and vice versa. Okay. So I learned this, and it takes a little while, and the teacher gives me feedback and all that sort of stuff. And then he says, okay, now go off and practice that for 20 minutes a day. Okay, and that's going to be your arm dance. And they come back and they show, see, I've gotten better at it and I'm doing it right. And if there's any kind of correction that needs to be done, it's done. Okay, so that part of the experiment's over. And then the next part of the experiment involves nothing to do with moving at all. It has to do with being able to make judgments on a person walking in front of the camera. Now, the thing about the person walking in front of the camera is that they're not fully illuminated. They are, in fact, under what we call this point light technique. And we talked a little bit about this when we were discussing the McGurk effect, right? I told you about some of the research we did in our lab where we rendered the face as just points moving. Here's an experiment where you render the body as points just moving. And that's what this is showing here. Oh, just that little video. Does this work? Let me see. No, I guess not. Shoot. Yeah, this is supposed to be a video that shows the points moving. Well, you've seen the McGurk effect, so you get a sense of what it is. Those points are shown to move, and then after a second or two, you notice that it's two people with points on their wrist, elbow, shoulder, and hip, knee, and ankle. Okay, and that's the kind of how you do body point lights instead of face point lights. Okay, so here's what happens. These subjects that learn the odd dance, the odd arm dance, we'd watch computer-generated versions of this. They look real. I mean, they look good. Of a person walking, I guess, from right to left across the field of view on a computer screen. Okay, so you see these point light walkers doing this. And I'm sorry the video doesn't work to show you this type of thing, but I think you get a sense of what it would look like. Just, kind of points moving, but it clearly looks like a person. Okay, and your job is very simple. It's just to say, you'll see two videos of these in a row, and just to say whether this is the same video that you saw in a row or was the second one different from the first one. So you can imagine this is pretty easy. People just are walking across the screen and then again, and your job is to say, is this the same or different? And they make it more complicated because the walker, after a little while, looks like he's drunk, essentially. So you would see, imagine these are point lights now you're just seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you're seeing something like this, like that. And you're asked to say now whether that drunk guy looks like the next drunk guy. And it's really difficult now that the whole thing has gotten to be such a mess. And that's, in fact, what this is portraying here, right here. Right? It's hard to tell there. But really what they're doing, the guy's not drunk, and it's been generated by a computer anyway. They're not trying to animate it to look drunk. What they're doing is they're animating it so that the limbs of the walker are at different phase relations. When we walk, typically we're at out of phase completely as we're walking. But when they animated these point light walkers, the phase relation between the limbs was not out of phase and not in phase. It was at a phase. They were at a coordinative relationship that was somewhere in between. Now, here's the difference. Some of the subjects, as they were learning the odd arm dance, were learning it at a phase relationship that was, I don't know, what is this, 225 degrees out of phase. And other folks were learning at that relationship, that odd arm dance, at a phase relationship that was 270, say, degrees out of phase. Okay, so don't worry about those numbers, but do know that the people who learned the arm dance at one coordinative relationship were able to see that in the walkers better. In other words, their kind of imitative motor learning facilitated their perceptual ability to see that same coordinative state in a walker. Okay, so that's what this means. Odd arm coordination facilitates point light walker perception in a very idiosyncratic way. In a very idiosyncratic way. And so I think that's a nice example of how learning a skill that, you know, clearly is very different from music. Maybe it's not too different from sports in a little ways, but I mean, it is not something that you know you would normally have to learn ever. It seems that your motor learning facilitates perception even for kind of nonsensical sorts of actions, which is interesting. There's other examples of this where somebody is trained on something very kind of idiosyncratic and shown to have just a perceptual enhancement for that idiosyncratic action as somebody else performs it. Okay, so it's a motor training facilitating the same perceptual skill in somebody else performing it. Okay, so it's, you know, kind of mirror neuron-ish sort of phenomenon. But there's other examples of this that involve restricting potential implicit imitation to show that perception is actually suppressed. And we've already talked about one of these, right? So this is restricting covert imitation, suppressing perception. We talked about blinded by Botox, and this is, you know, even though it sounds like one of these outlandish experiments, it absolutely works. That, you know, when somebody gets Botox and can't kind of use the musculature of the face or you know, induce some low level activity in the musculature of the face, it does have subtle but systematic suppression of perception of those exact expressions, right? So Botox doesn't, you know, suppress all the expressions on a face. Depending on where you get it, it might suppress smile muscles more. And if that's the case, you'll have more trouble. You'll have less sensitivity to subtle differences in smiles. If, on the other hand, you had frowns, your own frown muscles suppressed by Botox, then you would have trouble perceiving subtle differences in other faces' frowns. Okay, so that absolutely works in a very kind of muscle-specific way, which is very interesting. And there's other examples that aren't as kind of invasive. There's a number of experiments that show that people lose some of the perceptual sensitivity they have to recognizing the position or the actions of limbs if, in fact, their own limbs are occupied doing something else. So this is kind of a silly experiment. This has been done in more sophisticated ways, I'm sure. But the fact that it works even at this level is really interesting, I think. Subjects are asked to look at two photographs that may or may not be showing the same, the person with performing the same postures. And so I'm looking at this right now. So it looks like this is the same person, obviously, the image in the bottom right. That is the same person, and they are performing, I think, the same posture. I'm looking to see if there's any difference. Yeah, it looks the same, and it's just seen from two different angles. That's really the difference between the photos. And so, yeah, it took a couple of seconds, but I would say, yeah, that would be the same. And you see tons of these in the experiments, and your job is to say whether it's the same or different. And your accuracy would be measured, as would your reaction time. Okay, people aren't bad at this. They do okay. They're faster at some than others. And yeah, it's not that terrible a task people to do. But now what you do is you bring in another group of subjects and you have them occupy their arms or an arm as they're performing this task. Okay, so maybe you just, as they're performing the task, they're responding same or different with their right hand, but with their left hand, the left arm, they're swinging it. And what you find is that if they are in fact occupying their left arm as they're performing the task, they become worse and slower at making these judgments if the differences between the photos are in the arms. Okay, they're still good at recognizing leg differences, but arm differences, their ability, their accuracy, and their speed has been suppressed to some degree. If, on the other hand, you have people sit in a, on a table or something like that, so their legs can swing. Maybe you have them just swing their right leg, and they're still making the same judgments. Is that the same posture or different posture? Same posture, different posture. They are a little bit less accurate and a little slower at performing the task if the differences between the photos is in leg posture. If the only difference is in arm posture, if they're swinging their legs, they're perfectly fine. Okay, and vice versa. If they're swinging their arm and the only difference is in leg posture, then they're fine. It's just that the limb that's in motion, the limb that is acting, seems to have a bearing on perceptual sensitivity for that limb of somebody else. Okay, which is interesting. So what it suggests, and there's been more examples of this that are done with a kind of more sophisticated task, I think. But what it suggests is this, that your motor system influences how you perceive, even if it's subtle, in a body-specific way, which is really interesting. So that's the arm actions are going to affect arm perception. Leg actions are going to affect leg perception. Your coordinative, your enhancement of being able to perceive coordinative states of somebody walking is enhanced for exactly what you learned. Okay. So I think these are nice examples that are supportive of kind of some degree of perceptual facilitation from our motor system. Now, before we kind of go on and kind of talk about some more of this mirror neuron stuff, I want to stop here for a second and kind of take stock in what we're looking at here. Because yes, these are real effects. They are systematic effects. Even the crazy Botox one I love is a systematic effect, but they are subtle, right? They are subtle. Again, my friend who I see probably once a month, once every 2 months, gets Botox regularly. She does not have a problem perceiving my expressions when we're, interacting. Her problem would be if she's given, subtly different expressions and determining whether they're the same or different. Okay, it's a subtle effect. These leg and arm things that I'm showing with the photos here on the bottom of the slide, these are subtle decrements in performance. Okay, the alignment, the convergence stuff. This is not complete imitation. This is a subtle imitation. Oh, and then our new finding that people are better at understanding the speech of people who have inadvertently imitated them. Subtle effects, okay? So they are real, they are systematic, but they are subtle. Which kind of brings us back to the speech stuff, right? So, the evidence that the motor theory kind of suggested that, we use our motor system to perceive speech, and the evidence suggests, yeah, you can use your motor system to help you perceive speech, but, we are not too bad if, in fact, the motor system is inhibited. So maybe the involvement of the motor system isn't necessary. Maybe it's more facilitatory, right? So we can come back to that later on in the quarter, but let's go ahead now and finish up a couple of kind of big pieces of the story of the mirror neuron story. And I should say, I don't keep up with this literature. This is probably about 5 to 10 years old now, my knowledge and my slides on this, because it's a little outside my field. But about 10 years ago, there was some evidence for differences, intersubject differences in what we thought was mirror neuron system reactivity and kind of pretty overt behaviors. Okay, so empathy. We certainly know people we would say are more empathetic than others, right? And a lot of this just comes from, you can talk to your social psychology friends about this. There's ways of asking people to rate themselves and how empathetic a person they feel themselves to be, and how well that correlates with how much other people, their friends, their families, would rate their degree of empathy. Okay, I think we all know people who we would say are higher on the empathy scale and lower on the empathy scale. Sometimes that does correlate with people's self-ratings. Other times it doesn't. But I think overall there is some correlation. If you ask people and ask the people around them how empathetic a person is, you do see a correlation with those ratings and what seems to be reactivity from fMRI measures, reactivity in what we would call the mirror neuron system in the brain. Okay, so there is some evidence, and there was, I should say, somewhere, I think I kept that up to date about 5 years ago. I looked at that literature a little bit. And there was still some evidence that there was more mirror neuron system reactivity, based on brain imaging sort of work that correlated with one's own self-rated and others' rated empathy of the person. Okay, I don't know where that stands now. There is a ton of research, which I have absolutely not kept up with as of, say, 10 years ago, on autism spectrum disorders. You might know that this idea of the spectrum has kind of played a larger and larger role in a lot of aspects of psychology. In the old days we used to say, well, we used to think they either had autism or they don't, and then Asperger's kind of became a diagnosis, and now we know that it's probably very much a continuum. It's not like you either have it or you don't. There's certainly folks that are very high functioning that probably have certain characteristics of Asperger's sort of things. And in fact, we don't do this in our lab, but a lot of cognitive labs do. I think on campus, some of our cognitive labs do. I don't know if Weiwei's lab does it. Maybe you folks would know, or Lonnie's lab might, but giving a very quick kind of autism spectrum disorder kind of protocol, a questionnaire to people, has become somewhat routine just for general psychology experiments using the subject pool. Because what started to occur over the last few years is evidence that even if somebody would never, be labeled as Asperger's by their friends or their families, if they have some characteristics of that, they sometimes show different sorts of performance on things as, kind of plain as language tests or something like that, or analytical reasoning and things like that. So just, people that would never be classified as Asperger's or autistic from, clinicians or anything like that, having certain characteristics does show up in certain sorts of kind of very fundamental cognitive tests. So that's become a much more, so I know the folks in, I'm friends with folks at the UCLA linguistics department, and they include them, a quick ASD test in almost every experiment they perform just to see if there's any correlations there. It's interesting. Anyway, how does that relate to the mirror neuron system? Well, early on, folks that had severe autism did seem to show what we'd call structural abnormalities in the mirror neuron system, the areas that are considered to be part of the brain that are related to mirror neuron systems. Those folks, you might know, show delays in imitation. They do not gaze in an imitative way. They do not, their attention doesn't seem to be as affected by another individual's gaze, as we discussed was important. And even things like contagious yawning, which I guess is, one of the prototypic examples of mirror neuron system sorts of effects is shown less in individuals with autism. There have been theories that a part of the explanation of autism is that they have a poorly functioning mirror neuron systems. Now, I don't know where that stands. You folks might know more about that than I do. But about 10 years ago, when this was a really hot topic, mirror neuron systems, they had spent a lot of time looking into this for individuals with autism. And I haven't kept up with it, but I thought I should just mention it to you as something that's related. Okay. And then I wanted to talk about the kind of other implications. So, this is one of these kind of prime examples when a kind of very kind of surprising discovery is made in psychology and cognitive science in general. Very often you see people kind of run with it, that they really try to kind of push the idea in different directions, which is very creative, but sometimes it can, kind of create wishful thinking sort of findings. And I should mention that some of what went on here in the history of the mirror neuron system literature is it kind of pushed ideas that were related that were part of the replication crisis. So I want to be very careful here. So, we'll talk about embodied cognition in just a second. But embodied cognition was very much related to the mirror neuron system story. And you might know that a lot of the embodied cognition research findings are the ones that have been shown to be difficult to replicate. So, when something new, and this is very new, think about it, this is very surprising that there's a set of neurons that have double duty. We really can't divide the nervous system into afferent and efferent. It seems that there are neurons that we thought were really set aside for, inducing motor actions that are also sensitive to perception. Wow, that's profound. We've discovered all this kind of imitation that's going on between people that we never saw before. That's so cool. And people ran with it. So that's maybe why you get things that have been more difficult to replicate. So this is to some degree at the heart of the replication crisis. But other people have kind of thought about it kind of conceptually and come up with some interesting ideas that maybe, the fact that we have this imitative tendency help provide the basis for language. Language works because we, kind of share a code, and the sharing of the code could be based in kind of the coding that occurs between perception and production. So, I think that's an absolutely, sensible thing to kind of think about. I don't think you're going to do an experiment that's going to absolutely support this or not. But, you see that, when you start to see other animals with sophisticated, quote, sophisticated communication type systems, even if they're not, kind of generative as we believe our language is, they do show these imitative behaviors that underlie it. So the dancing bees, even things like calls in different animals and expressions and all that sort of stuff does seem to rely on an important degree to which animals will imitate each other. So I think it's an absolutely sensible idea. Whether or not it holds up, we'll have to find out. However, now we're going to just get a tiny bit more critical of it here. Oh, shoot, I didn't put it. So here's where the embodied cognition and emotion thing is. So yes, so we'll talk more about embodied cognition later on, but the idea of embodied cognition is that even when we are making what we consider kind of very abstract cognitive processing, even when we're involved in abstract thought and all that sort of thing, we can't help but involve our body states in that process. Okay, ideas are intimately tied to what the body is doing, what the body will be doing, even if we think, if there's a separation of idea and body. So, let's make this intuitive at first. I can think about the same idea. Let's see, whether the Kansas City Chiefs will go to the Super Bowl. again. I can, I've never thought about that longer than a few seconds. They are my favorite team, but I usually don't think of it very long. But say I was obsessed. I could think of it while I was taking a shower. I could think of it while I was having breakfast. It doesn't matter what my body's doing. I'm thinking about those Chiefs and all their great players and all that sort of thing, which suggests that my kind of conceptual thought is really separate from whatever my body's doing. But what the embodied cognition theory suggests is that even though there is that important separation that allows me to have consistent thought over inconsistent body actions, there is something my body is doing that is going to affect kind of the subtleties of my thought of the Kansas City Chiefs. And let me just very quickly say a couple of kind of paradigmatic sorts of experiments that you might know of, or maybe not. So in one experiment that showed how priming concepts can affect the body, what they did is they brought subjects into the laboratory and asked them to, it's a very simple word, non-word experiment, which I'm sure we've talked about before. They press a button if what they're seeing is a word. They press another button if what the letter string they're seeing is a non-word. And their time, so they try to press it as quickly as possible, and while keeping the accuracy there. So the actual words that come up are random, but there's a set of words that are part of the list that have to do with getting old. So gray, trying to think what else, elderly, retirement, pension, those sort of words would come up, okay, for one group of subjects. The other group of subjects just got all the other words and didn't have that set of, say, 10 words that had to do with getting old. Okay, that's the end of the experiment as far as the subject knows. They get their credit, they get their goodbye, and then they leave the lab, go down the hall, take the elevator out to the first floor. Okay. The dependent measure, though, is how quickly they walk down to the elevator. So they have cameras set up so they can be measured how quickly they walk from the door of the lab to the elevator. And guess what? It turns out that if, in fact, you were in the group of subjects that were primed with these words relating to the elderly, you seem to walk slower to the elevator than if you're in the group of subjects that didn't have that set of words in your word list. Okay, they walk faster. All right. Let's turn that around, and I think this is actually in some ways a more interesting experiment, this second one. That's the more famous one. This one's, to me, more interesting. What they had it's ultimately going to be the same laboratory task, as you'll see. But before the laboratory task, they had people walk around in large circles outside and timed their steps to the click of a metronome they listened to over headphones. So it's like, it's a very simple task at first. You're just going to walk around outside and listen to the click, 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 and take a step every time you hear a click. Okay. One group of subjects is hearing a set of clicks that's, nice pace, about the normal pace of a young person walking. The other group, you know where this is going, is hearing a slower click. So they're walking more slowly. Click, click, click. Okay, they're walking more like an old person. Then both groups come to the lab and are asked to perform that same task the other experiment involved, where they're pressing a key when they see a word, pressing another key when they see a string of letters that's not a word. But this time, the reaction time really matters. So they, the experimenters this is where the dependent measure is in this experiment. And the question is the group that walked more slowly going to be able to recognize that set of words that was related to getting old, pension, retirement, all those words? And the answer is yes. They were able, the group that was induced to walk more slowly before the computer test was able to recognize the elderly related words as words faster than the group that was asked to walk at their normal pace or a faster pace. Okay. The idea is their body state right before they came into the lab primed their concept unconsciously having to do with the elderly. So there's the body affecting, the kind of conceptual process, and the earlier experiment is the conceptual process affecting the body as the subjects walk to the elevator. Now, so these are classic embodied cognition examples, and there's other examples having to do with people kind of leaning forward versus backward, and then asked to give a narration of something, and supposedly they're more likely to talk about the future if they're leaning forward. They're more likely to talk about the past if they're leaning backwards. Okay. These are the sort of experiments that have been difficult to replicate. And some of these experiments might depend on what the experimenters and the research assistants know about the purpose of the experiments. So there's this kind of Bob Rosenthal kind of coercive experimenter effects going on here probably. So back to our original example of this, the walking down to the elevator experiment was not replicated cleanly. Okay. In fact, if the experimenters that ran the experiment knew the purpose of the experiment, it worked. If they didn't know the purpose of the experiment, it didn't work. The other one does work. The other one does replicate nicely, which I think is cool. So the one where people are told to walk slowly, that then primes their ability to recognize elderly words faster. Even if the experimenters did not know the purpose of the experiment at all, that one still worked. But these, in general, these embodied cognition experiments are often ones that have been difficult to replicate in the replication crisis. Okay, just so you know that. All right, let's continue. We'll talk a little bit more about embodied cognition later and where it stands. But let's talk about some. Oh, what the heck? This is not on my slide. I really apologize for this. Let me talk about these things. Common coding, that is just something that we have been discussing about the relationship between perception and production. Common coding is a term you might see in some of the papers that are related to this topic. And really what it involves is the idea that, the facilitation that might come from tapping into the production system must rely on some sort of coding that is similar for speech, say, production and perception. That's a great example of the speech. So we often say there's a common coding where such that the speech perception mechanism can kind of deal with the destruction of co-articulation by looking at the coding that's done by the production system of the phonemes into co-articulation. It's just another way of saying that the perception and production system basically speak the same language. Whether we're talking about speech perception or talking about these other sorts of instances where, using your production system helps you perceive facial expressions, they speak the same language, and that might help. So this common coding principle is related to that. And then multimodal input, I just kind of wanted to bring that in there one more time because it's something we're going to destroy later on. There are folks that suggest that multimodal integration, the integration of the senses, is dependent on us making use of a production system of some type. I think it's wrong, but there is this small school of thought that suggests that our ability to integrate our senses is dependent on the process tapping into production, because production doesn't care about the modality, right? Production doesn't care whether the input comes through the eyes or the ears or through touch. Okay, as we're talking about speech perception, we can talk about all those things, right? The production system doesn't care. It kind of wants to know, it kind of deals with the production primitives, what the action is, and doesn't care about how the information for that action is input. So that's where I think the idea comes from, that we can make integration possible because the production system renders the input kind of amodal. It doesn't speak. The production system doesn't speak in the language of specific types of sensory input. It just wants to know what the distal event is, the production event is outside. Okay, so that's how those things relate. Okay. So though, let's talk about these questions, and I've already kind of discussed this. Is an issue. To what degree is the mirror neuron system necessary and sufficient for imitation? Just as an example, it is unclear that that there is necessary involvement in what we would typically consider the mirror neuron system in the brain when people can imitate. So there's been research more recently showing that the differences between the areas in the brain that are considered to be mirror neuron system areas really don't differ in activation between when somebody performs a task on their own and somebody imitates a task. Remember before we said that these cells in the monkey seem to be most active during imitation of somebody else's event, actual physical imitation of somebody else's actions. That is not always the case when you look at the mirror neuron systems for humans. Very often it's the same degree of activity, whether one initiates the action themselves or is imitating the action of somebody else, which is interesting. What else? To what degree does covert imitation inform perception? Again, all these examples I gave with the blinded by Botox and having your limbs performing another task as you're trying to perceive the details of somebody else's limbs, these are all very, very subtle decrements. They are all very, very subtle decrements. So it's unclear, whether a mirror neuron system truly has to be involved in kind of general perception. And it's very much like the speech story. I think it's probably this whole discussion is probably best fleshed out in speech perception. Remember, we talked about examples there where people with aphasia, where they can't produce speech, are still able to perceive speech pretty darn well. There's some subtleties they have trouble with, or constraining that system with TMS or something like that. Constraining the motor system with TMS does have effects on perception, but they're very, very subtle. So covert imitation might not, be necessary, right? It might not be necessary for, normal perception to occur, or at least perception of everyday situations, I guess you can say. And the same story has been discussed with regard to what we called action understanding. So we talked a little bit in the beginning of our discussion on mirror neurons about this, that the monkeys seem to enlist the mirror neurons when they know there's a goal to the actions. If they don't see that there's something that's being reached to, they don't tend to involve the mirror neuron systems. But that's become a much more complicated story as the research of these systems has gone on, I could say. And then finally, how connected are action understanding and action production? It's the same thing, really. The newer research really puts into question the necessity of an action production system truly being involved in facilitating perception. It's stuff we talked about in the context of speech. It also applies to other sorts of actions besides speech. The speech system, for example, the speech motor system got involved when the input was a little degraded, when there was a lot of background noise. Maybe when you're learning a new language, you're learning the new phonemes of a new language as an adult, all those sort of things. Yes, our action systems can help out, but are they typically involved? Are they typically necessary? Those are the sort of questions that are being asked now with regard to inadvertent imitation and the motor neuron story in general. So that kind of keeps you up, and certainly your understanding of how some of these experiments are done in the speech context can carry over and into understanding this story in general beyond speech. Okay. Are there any questions about this? This now kind of ends our story of imitation, mirror neuron systems, and we're going to go back to the kind of philosophical implications of the computational approach after our break, but let me see if there's any questions at this point on what we discussed so far.
So I have two quick questions here. So the first one is, for many of the findings here, can we just relate these findings to the modularity of mind stuff? Like, for example, for the arm dance study, like if you're learning a new procedural knowledge about doing that, right? And that will somehow, you know, interfere with our perception or facilitate our perception. So does
Right.
that mean the perception of motion or the perception of walking stuff is not a module?
Oh, yes. So it's not a module because it can be penetrated, in other words. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
That's
so
this
it's
outside
not,
information is influencing how we're perceiving. Is that what you're saying? Is that what makes it non-modular in your thought?
yeah,
Yeah,
it's like
yeah, good. Okay, that's great. Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I would bet that the hardcore modularity people will say, no, that's a great example of a module because the arm dancing module, no, the arm coordination module is responsible for perception and production. So it's information within the module that is then affecting our perception. So I would say that both, remember, perception, for the kind of classic module examples, those systems, those modular systems are responsible for the production and perception of whatever function it's been designed for, right? So the module for speech is responsible for perception of speech and production for speech. The module for face recognition and expression recognition is responsible for perception of expressions and identity and production of expressions, production of, you know, other sorts of facial movements. So it is, I think they would say, oh, that's a great example. That's a great example that supports the internal workings of a module. No, it's not outside. You can't penetrate it from outside. It's still being affected by processes that occur within the module.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I roughly got the idea.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, we cannot say only motion perception is a module, but actually motion or arm dance is a module. It's not only perception.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so it's not, no, we don't have a motion module. Absolutely not. That's much too general. Yeah, we do not have a motion module according to this theory. Okay. We have, maybe it's you know, we have a module for perceiving the actions of others, or the, you know, the you know, kind of gross limb movement action of others. That's what we would say. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, it's great. And I have another question.
Yes.
So it's for the mirror neuron system. So I'm wondering for those like neuro studies, especially for the fMRI studies, are they like, how do they locate the mirror neuron system?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I don't know the current status of that, the current status of the details of that, but last I looked at, they were able to establish something like a single cell recording sort of method to look at these sorts of things. And I can't remember who did that. I think it was Jacoponi, the guy who, I think you've read a couple of papers by him. He's kind of considered one of the fathers of the mirror neuron story. I think they were doing something like a single cell recording method in you know, patients who were having brain surgery, say for you know, whatchamacallit, seizures or something like that, and they were trying to actually identify these in the brain. So yeah, I think that the at least the folks that kind of, you know, are proponents of the mirror neuron story believe that they've kind of gotten very specific about where in the brain these things are located. So yeah.
Yeah, that sounds really cool.
Yeah. Other questions? No? Okay, let's take our 10-minute break here, come back at 10:45, and then we will finish our discussion of the computational approach, so you'll be all set for the exam. Okay? All right, see you soon. Okay. Okay. Everything working? Yeah. You hear me okay? Good. Any other questions about the exam or about what we were discussing before the break?
How much do you think? So you've given us some evidence, kind of pro and con, for the mirror neuron stuff. How much of the kind of like higher order, like emotion and empathy and that kind of stuff, do you think is actually involved here?
Yeah, I embarrassingly haven't kept up with that literature. I should probably look at it again. My sense from talking to folks, that work on speech perception and kind of more low level sorts of action perception and things like that, is there's a lot of, I guess, I don't know, suspicion that maybe some of that research isn't as well grounded as it should be. So I kind of get this secondhand. I re-review papers, and often that stuff is kind of, always, when it is presented, it's presented with kind of questions. But it could be that if you go into that literature seriously and look how it's designed and all that, it has held up. I really don't know. I'm embarrassed that I don't know that. I probably should have looked at it again. But talking to my colleagues, they're very suspicious of it. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it's. I'm not trying to think of what context I would find it. So I go to conferences that sometimes that do address embodied cognition sorts of things, and those people have pulled back too since the issues with the replication crisis, and I don't. It could be that there's still some interesting story there. It's just not quite as, maybe, I don't know, as far-reaching as they thought. So I don't want to belittle it. I just know, I know that some of the original, originally it was, when the mirror neuron stuff started, it was thought that this is an essential part of what's going on. If it doesn't work right, then it leads to autism. If it breaks, during a stroke, then a lot of perceptual things are going to be problematic. But that latter stuff, at least, hasn't held up. I think and I come from a training. I personally have. I was, one of my graduate advisors was Al Liberman, the kind of father of the motor theory of speech perception, which back then was really, really influential. So given my training, one might think that I would be especially sympathetic to it. I just get very wary of the hype that occurred with it back in the early 2000s, I guess, 2010. And it was still pretty hyped. So I think this, certainly from what I know about the speech research, which I have absolutely kept up with, the notion that it is a necessary, essential part of the speech perception process, I think is probably incorrect. So sorry, I wish I knew more about the emotional stuff. I should look at it again.
Yeah, still a pretty good summary. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, other questions on anything, whether it's the mirror neuron stuff, imitation, or anything to do with the exam? No? We okay? Okay. Then let's just do...
Actually, I have one quick, overarching. So we've discussed three, kind of overarching theories, right?
More or less,
And
yeah.
we're about to sum up the last one, which is the computational one.
Yes, that is more or less. Yes, that is correct. We've gone when we started talking about some of the early thinking, it was clearly, I would guess, proto-computational in some ways, in that unconscious inference is about process, and potentially that leads to algorithm, which leads to a computational approach. But then, yes, we did go through theories a little bit, theories that were presented as more formal, such as the structuralist and the Gestalt theory, and now the computationalist. So yeah, I would say that's fine. That's a good way to think about it. And you could, go back to those flow charts or whatever that were listed, and if you understand, kind of on a deep level what's going on with those flow charts, then you'll have a nice sense of how to distinguish the theories. And remember, there's stuff in the theory. So, just thinking about the Gestalt theory, we talked about there being laws of organization, which were at least initially considered something that kind of was on board from birth, that the notion of innate is more, kind of subtle than typically we consider it with regard to this Gestaltist. So if you really understood all the kind of details that went into describing those flowcharts, then that would be a great way to study. Yeah. Other questions? Okay. Then let's go ahead. Oh, yeah, let me, all right. Just gonna put up a new set of slides here. Yes. So we're gonna talk about some of the, now that we've kind of got a good sense of the computational approach and some of its examples, and everything I've been talking here, let me say this. About modularity. I understand there's still some confusion because I know a lot of you use the term differently. What I'd like you to do for this first exam, when we talk about modularity, is talk about it in its most kind of most elaborated and kind of most formal sense, which is that sense that we've been discussing, the Fodor sense, Jerry Fodor sense of modularity of mind. So think about when I use modules on the test on this first exam, it will refer to all those characteristics that we laid out with modularity. I know people use the term very different here, so Mac mentioned something about a motion module or something like that. It is a different sort of idea. So let's pretend when it comes to the modularity, that we're discussing characteristics that were first laid out in the 80s and 90s, even though we use the term differently here. Why are we doing that? Well, because I think those characteristics that are laid out for modularity are still very useful characteristics, even if we no longer use those ideas in the context of how we more loosely use the term module now. To think of them in that original context, I think, is very helpful. So yes, I realize that we are talking history to some degree when we use that term. As I want you to use it now, and that will change as we go through the second half of the course. I mean, maybe we can just call it classic modules or traditional modules or Fodorian modules, sometimes they're called. But let's think of it like that now, okay? And then we will change that as the quarter goes on, just to make sure there's no confusion. That when I talk about modules on the midterm exam, we are talking about the Fodorian modules as I've been discussing them. Okay, I want to make sure that's very clear. But those modules are computational devices. I mean, that was something Jerry Fodor was very clear on, and my old advisor, Al Lieberman, was very clear on, that we were talking about a computational view of mind. It was just a computational view of mind that was kind of functioning a tiny bit differently and with a degree of sophistication that non-modular processes were working with, right? So the modular theory of mind is going to make use of production. It's going to so it's going to function differently and have all those kind of idiosyncratic things that speech have, for example. Those also hold for faces. Hopefully you have some sense of that. But the impenetrability, the kind of limited access to understanding what's going on in the module, the multi-sensory aspects of it. Those are, all kind of unique in some ways, but what's not unique about a module is its basis in computational processing. So whether you talk about a speech module or general auditory processing, which is probably not modular, right? Okay, we're talking about computational processes going on the inside. All right. So that kind of brings us back to one of the issues that we discussed in the very beginning of the quarter, and mentioned that we'd have to come back to again and again. And that is the homunculus problem, because we have to somehow rationalize what is going on in the system without kind of trying to impart the answer with the sort of thing we're trying to explain. Remember, this leads to kind of this infinite regress and this problem of circular explanation. And it's a problem, as I mentioned, it's a problem for all of psychology, whether or not it's acknowledged or not. And circular explanations can be a real problem that sometimes aren't really. We discussed this in the context of memory. So why am I able to remember the name of my first grade teacher? Well, it's information I keep in my memory system. What is a memory system? Well, it's that system where I keep all that old information, and that allows me to remember things. And then, that's the sort of thing you want to try to avoid, and that potentially psychology, unlike the other sciences, is plagued with, right? The idea that there is a kind of a ghost in the machine, that there's something in there that whether we want to call it an awareness or a willful ego or something like that, that the other sciences don't really have to seem to deal with. The whole notion of the mental, as we discussed, is something that's unique to psychology, and it causes problems such as the homunculus problem. So in 1980, I'm going way back again, but this was the beginning of the computational approach. And one of the reasons it became so popular, I think, was that it was very, very much supported by philosophers such as Daniel Dennett. In 1980, he wrote this paper about the homunculus problem and whether the computational approach could solve it. All right, so something philosophers think about all the time, this ghost in the machine, the homunculus. Daniel Dennett thought maybe this is something that can now be solved with the computational approach and only the computational approach. So let's go a little bit into the story. Dennett, thought that by its very nature, psychology is based on representations, right? And so I think this is something that we intuitively agree with, at least, that what's being processed is a representation of the things in the world, or what we assume are the things in the world. And we've discussed this a number of times, right? So the little tree we're looking at never gets into the head. What gets into the head is a representation of that tree. And somehow, when you have representations, they have to be representations not just about something in the world, they have to be representations for something that interprets it. And this is what's leading to the homunculus problem. A psychology has to be based on representations. And when things get better and we all got our Pfizer vaccines in a few months and we're back in the building, I want you to knock on everybody's door and say, is psychology based on representation? And everybody's going to open their door and say, so happy to see you back on campus. And the answer is, of course. Psychology has to be based on representations. We don't have the world in our head. We have representations of the world in our head. And that makes psychology fascinating. Sometimes those representations are wrong. So, we might have certain thoughts about our significant others and maybe they're not right. I don't know, don't want to scare you, but this is part of clinical psychology and social psychology and all that sort of stuff. But certainly on a more fundamental level, like, perception, the things in the world don't get in our heads, representations of those things get in our head. And sometimes, as we understand for perception, those representations kind of stink. And so some sort of process has to work on them. So psychology without representations ain't going to happen, right? Psychology is the study of mental life, mental experience. However, Dennett believes that representations kind of require some type of homunculus. Again, we have a representation about the world. These representations are going to be representations about things in the world, but in order for them to have meaning as a representation, they have to be representations for something that's going to interpret the representations. And regardless of how we think of that interpretation, whether it's an interpretation that involves structuralism, an interpretation that involves Gestalt principles, or a representation or interpretation of the representations that involve, some sort of computation, some sort of sophisticated set of algorithms or something like that. Okay, there is something there that needs to interpret the representation. So we're using the term homunculus much more broadly here. We're not just talking about a little agent in the head that's doing the interpreting. We're talking about maybe a process that's doing the interpreting. Okay, maybe an algorithm that's doing the interpreting, maybe the laws of organization that are doing the interpretation. But that's still a homunculus in that we now need to explain how those things got there and then what's interpreting the processes, right? So we're kind of really making this homunculus problem much, much more general. It's not a problem with little guys in your head, okay, little agents, little spirits, little souls. It's a problem for processes as well that interpret this. Okay, how does it get there? Who does the interpreting of the process? Okay. Then I thought, well, homunculi are philosophically untenable, meaning that it's hard to imagine any type of homunculus, no matter how we construe it, as being something that will be satisfying in a philosophical sense. That aren't we just pushing things back? Aren't we just pushing things back into the problems going back? So are we in fact imparting to the process of computation the same things that we've been trying to explain in the beginning, right? That's the idea of the homunculus problem. You're just kind of pushing it back further and further. And then it's saying that, anything that has representations, anything that needs to interpret representations, any type of interpreter can really be thought as a philosophical homunculus, which is clearly problematic. Okay, so then it has these premises. Psychology without representation is impossible. Representations without homunculi are impossible. Homunculi are philosophically untenable, and therefore psychology is impossible. Okay, class dismissed. No, kidding. This is serious. This is a serious issue, and it's something that philosophers continue to discuss. But back in 1980, what Dennett thought is, well, let's see if the computational approach can allow us to solve this, at least in spirit. So this is what he thought is, okay. So what are we talking about? What is really the homunculus problem? Well, the homunculus problem is, in a sense, what we're doing is we're trying to explain an intelligent process with an intelligent process, right? And so we're kind of taking, by pushing it into the level of process, into the level of organizational principles, associations, all that stuff. What we're doing is we're kind of, what he used to, I think the term he uses is that we're taking out a loan on intelligence, that we're kind of, just deciding that the intelligence comes at the process level, not before that, or at the level of the organizational principles or something like that. And that's still a homunculus problem, according to Dennett, at least. So he says, okay, so let's think about what that intelligence is. What is let's concentrate mostly on the computational approach. What's truly involved in what we're calling an intelligent process? He said, if we think about it, let's go back to our friend Turing. How intelligent is the process that Turing laid out for us, right? Because in Turing, we're talking about dots and dashes, or little slashes, or whatever, zeros on magnetic tape, all that stuff. Is that intelligent? Is there something intelligent there? And so he thought of this. Okay, so let's try to disperse the intelligence. And that's maybe exactly what the computational approach, and only the computational approach, can do. So, for example, the first way we can disperse the intelligence of a process is we can break things down into a flowchart. And this is a flowchart that's not characterizing a theory. This is a flowchart that's characterizing a process. And I don't know what this one does. I think I just pulled one up. Yeah. This is whether there's actually a fire, whether somebody realizes there's a fire, say in the hotel they're staying at, and they hear a fire alarm, and then they have to make decisions. If do I detect a sound? If no, then I don't have to worry about it. I don't know what this says here. You understand the idea that any sort of cognitive process, perceptual process, psychological process can be thought as going through a set of stages where if this has been determined, then this happens. If that has been determined, then that happens. Okay. So already, says Dennett, we've taken a sophisticated cognitive psychological process and broken it down into things that are dumber. Okay. Do the ears detect a sound? Okay, yes or no. Does the nose detect smoke? Yes or no, right? So, trying to determine whether there's a fire in the hotel, which is possibly in a kind of altogether a complicated process, the computational approach is going to allow it to be broken down into subroutines, sub-processes. Right? And if you were to design a computer or a robot to do this sort of thing, it's exactly how you do it, right? So there's a robot that walks through the corridors of a hotel and tries to determine if there's a fire and then guides people out, right? Guides people out if there is a fire. And this is how you would design it, right? You first you say, okay, well, how do we design a robot? And you put out a flow chart in the meeting. You say, okay, first it needs to detect sound. Then if there's an alarm, then smoke through its air ventilator system or whatever, heat, all this sort of stuff. And you've taken a very complicated process, detecting a fire and warning people and saving people's lives, into subroutines. So that's the first way a computational approach is broken down into simpler subcomponents. So we've already made it a dumber system. It's now becomes kind of not a system that is like a big homunculus that's trying to solve the problem that using a sophisticated process. Instead, it's a set of stupid homunculi, which, if we think about what each of those subroutines is really doing, thanks to Turing, is just binary switches, binary states, right? So a computer works by, setting up, algorithms on binary code, which themselves are really, really stupid homunculi, right? These are just yes/no states. Of course, the string is going to be important. They have to be strung together correctly. But each of those little states, the yes/no states, are in fact as dumb a homunculus as one could possibly have. So what Dennett is suggesting here is that the nature of a computational approach to mind might be the best solution we can have to the homunculus problem, because when you really look at what's going on here, it's just strings of on and off switches. It's just strings of yes and no's. And those are the dumbest possible homunculi one could ever want. So you're taking, so if we're talking about cells now rather than switches, this is the same exact idea, right? Assuming, we can discuss cells as being kind of all or none, kind of trigger mechanisms, then we can talk about those as being the dumbest possible homunculi you have. And therefore, you're taking very little loan on intelligence, okay? You're taking, oh boy. All right, hold on just a second. I need to send a little text message to my wife because the gardener's here and she needs to give him a check. Hold on just a second. Too much information. You don't need to know that, but I don't want to stop class because I have a lot to talk about. Please give the gardener a check and make sure Max doesn't attack him, period. Max. Okay. Anyway, sorry. Much too much information and insight into my home life, but there you go. So anyway, what Dennett's saying is this is the only way to really solve a homunculus problem. And no other theoretical account of perception is going to allow this. We need computation to be there to break it down into the dumbest possible homunculi ever. Now, I know what you're thinking. Some of you are saying, okay, that makes sense. I think in spirit it could make sense, but I mean, are we really explaining the complexity of the process? And in other words, how does the design get there? How does the design get there? Really, because that's what makes these homunculi sophisticated ultimately. And what Dennett would say is that's not really the job of the philosopher or the psychologist to determine. It's really the job of the evolutionary biologist, the geneticist, to determine how these simple homunculi, how the neurons even, got to be the way they are. So that's their job. That's the processes of evolution, development, ontogeny, all that sort of fancy stuff. That's going to be the job of the biologist then. We know that evolution kind of refines things, and that must be how the little homunculi, tiny little stupid homunculi, got to be organized in such a way as to be sophisticated and be able to solve these things. Okay. And the question we have to ask ourselves kind of as students is, okay, are we going to feel satisfied with that? Does it make sense for us to say that's not really our problem, is the problem of the evolutionary biologist, to discuss the kind of the programming basis of these computations? And some people are comfortable with that. Some people are not comfortable with that. Are there ways of explaining, how sensory systems, that even like amoeba, detect things without, kind of referring back to something that might be expected to evolve, right? So, I mean, it's an interesting question. But I thought that. Go ahead. Go ahead. Someone else going to ask something. Go ahead.
Sorry, no, I just had a thought. Like, we have larger scale homunculi essentially in anatomy, right?
Right.
Like, I'm thinking in terms of like Broca versus Wernicke's area in the brain. You can have aphasia different ways. You could just lose your ability to interpret things.
Right.
So how is that distinct from the homunculus is too big problem?
Well, even if those things are broken, and we can talk about there being separate homunculi, and I think that maybe that would be consistent with Dennett in some ways. Anything that still works, is still going to have to be, still going to have to be an interpreter. So regardless of whether it works or not, in some ways, it's kind of the principle of whether it working by virtue of a binary code overall kind of solves the problem. I mean, your point's well taken in that, yeah, so maybe that's what we're talking. We're talking about subroutines here. So yes, I think that there's good evidence that subroutines are part of what goes on, and therefore we can talk about those homunculi being really stupid, but still they have to be kind of sophisticated homunculi to do their normal stuff. So Dennett's move to take it down to the level of binary code, I think, is really what makes this possible solution powerful. Does that help?
I mean, yeah, it makes sense. And this type of approach, like, I see it echoed a lot in people talking about, oh, well, the neural circuit between here and here has, these different layers. And if you get really small into even the layers of cortex and that kind of thing. But,
yeah. That and there's kind of a running presumption that to the degree we need to talk about representation being something that is kind of core to psychology, the neurons do it. I mean, it's so funny. When I was writing my book, I'm very hesitant to do this, and I do never do this in my writing of scientific papers, but when I teach sometimes, and certainly in my book, which was written for the layperson, I would say things like, I would give intent to the brain. I would give intent to that the neurons want this, that the brain wants this. And it's such a lazy way of speaking. It really, really is. And it drives me nuts when I read that in science. I do read it in scientific papers. It drives me nuts. But there is, it's a way of connecting with the lay audience in some ways. So I give myself a little leeway that way. But it's kind of a cop-out when it comes to understanding process is saying, well, we don't have to understand this detail of the process because that's something that the neurophysiologists will do. But without discussing, the function thoroughly enough, the poor neurophysiologist doesn't know what to look for. They can be told to look for the wrong thing or something like that. So that's sort of kind of slippage between function and neurophysiological basis can run into problems too. So I'm very sympathetic to your point there. Okay. Other questions, points? Okay, then we're going to move on and talk about one of our favorite examples. And I bet you a lot of you folks know this from undergraduate classes, but I think it's important to discuss here. And it is the idea of of whether formal systems understand, because we certainly do, right? We believe that when we are experiencing the world, that we have some meaningful understanding of it. Perception we believe is meaningful, down to the level of vision and hearing and all that sort of stuff. And if we are a computational system, not unlike the computational systems that we have in front of us, our computers, then what allows us to have a meaningful, knowledgeable contact with the world, but not our computers? Okay, it's the age-old question. It is something Turing had brought up, back in the 30s or 40s, was it? Yeah. And there's some, we've talked about, there's some great examples. That's a still from a movie that's great, really nicely done about the Turing test, Ex Machina, I think it's called. If you haven't seen it, it's really fun. And what Turing thought is, as is in the movie, if a machine can fool you into thinking that you're interacting with a person, and in this case, the person ends up, I guess, falling in love with this machine, despite her looking like this, that for all intents and purposes, the machine knows. The machine understands the world. Now, I think we've decided we aren't that comfortable with that definition. I mean, I think we can be fooled. Certainly, we discussed the example. And Dennett's other example that we discussed in the classes is chess playing example, where if you don't know if you're playing with a real opponent or a computer opponent, like probably most chess players don't, then we can say the chess computer really understands what it's doing. It has goals and desires and intent to win and all that sort of stuff. And I think, it's a machine. I think a lot of us would say, I'm not sure I'm completely comfortable with saying it's understanding the world, that its play is meaningful to itself, that it has a goal to win, like we have goals to win, that whole component. And so it was something that was, kind of criticized back then. So, Dennett would say that, yeah, this is the solution to all of our philosophical problems. And then John Searle, another philosopher back then, who, by the way, it was the advisor of Eric Schwitzgebel, our colleague in our own philosophy department. I believe I've mentioned him before. If I haven't, or if you are interested in the sort of things we're discussing now, I beg you to take one of his classes as a breadth requirement. He is a wonderful teacher, a great guy, very creative, and thinks about these things much more deeply than I'd ever be able to talk about them. But these are important ideas. John Searle said, let's think about what's really going on with computational systems, whether they are the computational systems in our computers or in ourselves. And I'll go through this. I'm not sure. I want to say, no. Let me go through it as if you don't understand this. I think probably some of you have been through it, but that's okay. So here's the idea behind the Chinese room example, that a computational system, like Turing's system, or the type that we're sitting with right now, our computers, is kind of like imagining a situation in which you are communicating from the outside of a room with something, and you're not quite sure what's inside, but you're able to do it. In fact, you're able to communicate with Chinese. Say you know Chinese, say you're a native Chinese or a second language Chinese speaker. And what you do is you, I think Searle's example is you have Chinese characters that are in front of you, and you decide you want to ask questions about what's going into the room, and so you take the Chinese characters, knowing Chinese, and put them under the door and ask questions like, "What's it like in that room? Are you comfortable?" Whatever. You're just told that there's something in the room that you can communicate with, and you slip those Chinese characters underneath, and in a couple of minutes, other Chinese characters come out, and you look at them and you read them in Chinese, and you say, "Oh, yes, I'm comfortable. It's a little warm, but otherwise I can't complain." Okay, let's ask some other questions. You ask them whether there's food available, how you got in there, all this fun stuff. Okay, so now let's take a look at what's going on inside the room. I'm inside the room. Rosenblum's inside the room. Here I am. And I'm comfortable. I'm wearing shorts. Okay, it's not too hot. I've got a doggy that's keeping me company. But there I am. And guess what? I don't know Chinese from anything. I don't know Chinese from Korean, from Japanese, or any other language that's in the general region of the world. I've never learned Chinese. I don't even know if the characters that I would be seeing are true Chinese or something else. But here I am inside the room, and in come these characters underneath the door, and I pick them up, I look at them, I put them down on a table, and I've got a book here that's going to give me rules of how to respond based on the Chinese characters I see. So I lay them out, and I say, okay, this one's first, this one's second, and I look it up in the book and say, okay, when I get this string of characters, here's the string of characters I need to put out under the door to the person on the outside. So I do that, I find those characters, and I've got another stack of characters over here, and I pass them out, and there you go. Now you think I understand Chinese. I understand no Chinese. And that is what Searle is thinking a computer is really about, or a computational system in general is really about. So this is Rosenblum the homunculus. I have no understanding of Chinese. I am acting, as we discussed earlier, a Turing machine is acting, purely formal. I'm just manipulating symbols, and those symbols to me have no meaning whatsoever. You on the outside think, oh, okay, I'm having a great interaction with this system. I'm having a great interaction with Siri. I'm having a great interaction with one of these robots that's on the internet that can simulate somebody. I'm having a great interaction with Spotify giving me recommendations. But in none of these cases, including when there's a real person inside a room, me, okay, is there true understanding going on. In other words, what Searle is saying is that you can absolutely pass the Turing test without there being knowledge involved, without there being any meaning perceived. And that might threaten a computational approach, a purely computational approach. And you know where this sort of story is going. That's the way our computers work, right? We hope, right? We don't think our computers or Siri or the little algorithms that are used for Spotify or anything like that, we are interacting with in a way where, we're interacting and responding as if there's an understanding going on, but deep down we know there's no understanding going on. And if we're trying to explain human behavior and animal perception and cognition of people with a computational approach, we've got a little bit of a problem here, right? Because computation can act as if it understands without understanding. So what makes us believe that we have an understanding of a world, that we have meaningful interactions with the world, and a computer doesn't, if in fact we are not much more than computational devices? If we're construing perception as computation, which is manipulations of symbols, right? That's what computation is here. What makes our interactions with the world meaningful, but not Siri's, okay? Not your computers.
Is this necessary though? Is if something that's meaningful and something that's non-meaningful are indistinguishable from one another, then right, what does it matter? That's always been my response to this question.
Right. Right. So if they are functionally indistinguishable, does it mean anything? Well, I mean, we do believe. I mean, yeah. I mean, as folk psychology would have it, we do believe we have, we have meaning, we have intent, we have understanding. You're saying that it doesn't really matter whether or not we have that. That maybe is illusory or something like that. Is that what you're saying? That's kind of a the idea that we have a free will that to interpret things differently or to act. It doesn't matter if that's real or not. Is that what you're saying? Yeah, I mean,
as long as it feels the same, it doesn't make a difference.
Right, it's great. I mean, that I love these questions. It's great. Now, absolutely, yeah. I mean, you could say that it doesn't matter really. I think it kind of goes against a lot of people's intuitions. I think a lot of philosophers might have problems with that because then it suggests that free will isn't real. Then it kind of leads us down some very kind of uncomfortable moral roads, of course, right? But I mean, then what do we do with our intuitions about having meaningful contact with the world? I mean, do we just say that's just illusory? That's not really part of the equation. That has no bearing on anything. Some people would be comfortable with that. Some people wouldn't, potentially. I think most psychologists wouldn't. But it's an interesting point. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the history about how some of the philosophers address this, and I'm sure some of the philosophers maybe brought that up. But this is actually, I think I posted this reading. It's from an old book that came out in the 80s. That's fun. I mean, it's kind of historically dated now, but it does a nice job of describing this. So if you're interested in getting a quick introduction, it's not a bad piece. So Searle was at Berkeley at the time when he published this. And he had colleagues there that were also in his department that came up with a possible solution. And it was this. So I'm going to call this the Berkeley position, even though Searle is at Berkeley. I think he was at Berkeley at the time when he published this, but he certainly retired there. But what came to be known as the Berkeley position on this as a possible solution to this was the following, that it's not Rosenblum that understands. I mean, that's really an unfair thing. It's the entire system that understands. It's Rosenblum, the homunculus, plus the, so I guess as the homunculus, Rosenblum is the processor. We can say that too, if it makes us more comfortable. It's not just the processor, it's the symbols, and it's the rule book that is kind of enabling and guiding the processor. Okay, so the entire system understands it. It's not just the manipulator of the symbols, or it's not the symbols. It's that plus the symbols plus the rule book that Rosenblum has in front of him. Okay. However, what Searle said is, okay, well, that's easy. We can get Rosenblum. I'm using my own term, but my own name. But the idea is the process. We can get the whatever sort of process is in there can actually memorize the rules. I mean, that's not something we don't need a distinct rule book, right? The agent or the homunculus, the process could memorize the rules and actually use something else other than the symbols if it wanted to. That doesn't make too much of a difference. Those things aren't absolutely constrained. And still, there would be no understanding of Chinese involved in that process whatsoever, right? All that the rule book says is, when you get this string, pass out this string. When you get this string, send the pieces of paper out in this string. Okay, that's it. That's all the rule book has in it. And if I memorize it, I'm sure if I've been in there for a few years, I would absolutely memorize it. I've got nothing else to do besides play with the doggy. Okay, I would memorize it. And what Searle would say, it doesn't make a difference. It still has no understanding. Whatever's in there still has no understanding of Chinese. Okay, philosophers at Yale, and you don't need to memorize these that the Yale position says this, all this sort of stuff. Just know the different positions so you can discuss them in an essay or something. Is the problem here is that this system that that Searle has portrayed is really not something that is kind of grounded in the world. We need, the reason we as computational beings have a meaningful relationship to the world is because we interact with the world. Computers don't really interact with the world in the same way. And Searle's, position on this is, it's what I call the Power Ranger position. It's like, let's do this. Let's place the robot. I'm sorry, place the room in the robot's head, in a robot's head. So I don't know if you're a fan of the Power Rangers. I wasn't. My kids were for about a week, and it's the noisiest and most kind of flashiest show in the world. I couldn't watch it very long, but if you know anything about the Power Rangers, you know that they have fighting abilities on their own, but when something like a giant mean robot attacks them, what they do is they can make themselves into a giant mean robot and kind of work, from inside the robot's head, the various, limb movements and all this sort of stuff that would defeat the evil giant robot. Okay, so what you're doing essentially is you're putting, a computational system inside the head of a robot where the outcome is no longer information about Chinese, but the outcome, the symbol strings that are passed out, control the robot's arms or control the robot's guns or whatever it is. And the information that comes out are no longer Chinese characters, but they're symbol strings that on the outside world represent, there's a giant robot out here and he's shooting this type of gun at me. I better, block it somehow or something like that. But for all intents and purposes, from inside the robot head, it's just manipulation of symbol strings. Those little Power Rangers don't really know what's going on in the outside world. They just know what the cameras and sensors and all that sort of thing are telling them on their little consoles, and then they're just responding to the consoles, assuming that there's some real action going outside. So by putting this, Chinese room or this computational system into some agent that has interactivity with the world isn't going to make it have any understanding of the world, right? The whole thing can work as a simple manipulating device without having any awareness of truly what's going on outside in the world. Okay? Stop me if there's any questions or any ideas on this. But let's move up New England a little bit and go to MIT. And the philosophers there also had a position. This is actually Fodor and a philosopher named Zenon Polishin, which is this. Okay, it's not the computation, it's not the process that allows us to understand the world, us to have a true kind of successful set of interactions with the world. It's the fact that we have neural machinery, okay? It's the fact that we have some sort of, complexity of neurons that provide the true understand or meaningful contact with the world. And once you kind of render the Chinese room like that, then we have to say it really does understand. The Chinese room in and of itself does not, but once you start having it, include neural machinery, it might, right? And what Searle did is he came back and said, okay, let's make the agent Rosenblum task a little bit more sophisticated. What happens now is Rosenblum it works with plumbing. Okay, Rosenblum works with plumbing. Right, there I am. Okay, and so spigots of water come in, and depending on that pattern of water flow, Rosenblum looks up in a book about what to do to change the water flow so it affects what the output is. Okay, so these 5 faucets are on. I look it up in the book and say, when these 5 faucets are on, then I go and turn these faucets off and these faucets on, and that's what the output is. So in other words, what I'm doing here is essentially emulating what the neural kind of activity might be. Okay, so you can talk about it in plumbing, and I can talk about it as neurons too, like I'm just flipping little neurons on and off or something like that. And what understands there that didn't understand before, right? What is it about the neurons that allow an understanding versus plumbing or sheets of paper or rules in a book? Nothing. Okay. So what does Searle think's going on? Searle thinks that there is something special about biology but it's not a computational aspect of biology that is really needed for understanding. And we will talk about that at some point. I think it was a little ambiguous the way he presented this in his original paper. By the way, I don't know if I assigned the original of this, but there's a wonderful BBS article where these debates are also discussed. And his solution was not completely satisfactory at the time, but he said that it's not just neural circuitry that's important, it is certain aspects of biology that are much more fundamental and are probably in some ways true of things that we might not normally think of as having, meaningful interactions with the world, that provide this. Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But Polishin, this guy at MIT, who I mentioned before, says, okay, Searle, you got some problems here with that solution because we've got the RoboCop. He didn't call it this, but I like to think of it as the Rosenblum the RoboCop sort of problem. Okay, because imagine all this time I've been talking to you. Guess what's been happening? You can't see it because of the green screen I'm using behind me. But okay, Serena, my grad student. Okay, I trust her. She's a great student. She's behind me. Okay. And my skull is open. You can't see it, but my skull is open. And one by one, she has been replacing my neurons with silicon chips. And this has been happening for the last 2.5 hours. She's been replacing my neurons with silicon chips. Okay? And, this is interesting because I don't think you noticed, right? I mean, did you notice when all of a sudden I had more silicon chips than neurons in my brain? Probably not. Do you think that when I had more silicon chips than neurons in my brain, I no longer understood what I was saying? Probably not. And this is what Polishin's saying. It's like, what could there be about biology that we can't, simulate by replacing neurons with silicon chips that have the same function as the neurons? I mean, at what point do we say that this agent no longer understands truly what it's talking about because it's now a silicon-based device versus a carbon-based device? That seems arbitrary in some ways. So RoboCop, by the way, maybe you guys haven't seen. There's two versions of it, but the idea in RoboCop is there's a cop. He gets in a terrible accident. He gets very, very, very much hurt, and they replace part of his brain with a computer, and he still has part of his brain. And so the question is whether or not he has free will still, whether he has the same kind of history that his organic brain does, that plays a role in his psychology. It's a kind of big, flamboyant, violent movie, but there's some interesting philosophy there too, which is why I brought it up. Okay, so these are bigger questions than this course can spend time with, but hopefully you see the problem that what is it that allows us to, if meaningful contact with the world is something real, and a free will is something real, and making choices is something we believe we can do, then what is it about our computational system that allows that, but a computer's computational system does not? Okay, and there's lots of questions this goes to. So what does know? What does understand? When we say that a person understands a situation, we say an animal understands the environment they're in and has some sort of meaningful contact with its world. Is it the brain that knows this? Is it the kind of process that knows this? Is it the entire animal that somehow knows this? That their body has to be involved somehow? These are I'm just kind of posing these questions for your interest. It really it's a difficult thing. To say that, what does it mean to say that a piece of hardware knows, right? Whether it's a computer, silicon-based, or human, carbon-based. If the circuitry is the same thing, then do we say it's gotta understand? If the process is the same, do we say it's gotta understand? All that sort of thing. But this does go, and like I suggested before, it does go beyond questions of just the philosophy of mind. It goes into things about, whether we can, truly talk about choices we make, or is it something in our our brain. And you know, you probably are aware of this, that defense lawyers are using brain scans to show that the you know, the criminal, the person that's been convicted usually, um, doesn't have the free will to make these terrible choices if they've killed people or something like that. It's that their brain looks like this, which is a little different from how other people's brains. And so it has nothing to do with a choice they've made. It has to do with their brain structure or their brain's physiology or something like that. And so, you know, I mean, the questions of free will arise in this context too. So this is more far-reaching. I just, you know, I just want to throw these things in. This is more far-reaching and possibly more practical than just, you know, kind of philosophy of mind, you know, models of perception, models of cognition than this. Okay, how much time do I have? I have time for some quick questions if you guys want to ask anything now. And there's a lot to think about here, but if you haven't, especially if you haven't been through the story, I imagine some of you have. But no,
I don't know. For me, I at least did the same vein of the, you know, complaint I was making earlier. Like, what's the difference between my brain made me do something, or I just did something? Like, the end result is that person did something.
right.
I don't know.
Right, but we do have different laws, right? Obviously, if we think that the person did it out of their intent versus not. I mean, you know, kind of criminal law is you know, kind of built off of that sort of thing.
Well, we know he's guilty of manslaughter or nothing else, right? So, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, but you can see this gets very complex, right? This gets very complicated, and you know, I mean, whether we truly have an understanding of what's in the world or not, you know, kind of our, you know, the field is kind of based on that in a way, right? The field of psychology is that, you know, we have either correct or incorrect ideas of what's in the world and ideas of other people, suggesting that, you know, there is some truth to be had, right? We believe that there is a truth, and for us to believe there is a truth believes that there has to be some degree of understanding of that truth, I guess. So yes, I completely understand your approach to this, but know that that has a lot of ramifications for practical things in the world. So
It seems like Micah's idea is like somewhat similar to behaviorism, in my view.
to what idea? I
To
missed that.
behaviorism. To the behaviorism. I don't know if I pronounce it.
Behaviorism? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Absolutely. So that was actually one of the criticisms of Skinner when, you know, that stuff originally came out. If like it's all, you know, operant conditioning, then where does free will play a role? And that there was some really interesting discussions. I think he had a book called Beyond Free Will. I think it's called Beyond something. Free Will and Destiny is a good. Yeah, those were very serious discussions. Really interesting stuff if you have time to go back to that stuff. And we all have time now. You know, my favorite quote about free will. Did I mention this? My favorite quote of free will is from this Yiddish writer, Isaac Bashev Singer, who wrote, "We all must believe in free will. We have no choice." And I think that you know, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, we have to believe that, you know, he was somebody who gone through the Holocaust and all that sort of stuff, and like, you know, there were, you know, very intentional choices made, you know, throughout the history of all this stuff, and we have to hold people accountable for it. You know, it's not, even if there is no true free will, which, you know, there are arguments that there isn't. You know, it kind of is the basis for who we are in some ways. So, okay. Other questions or points about the Chinese room example? Okay, then let me just finish on this last slide. And this is a nice concept from our friend Jerry Fodor called methodological solipsism. And what this has to do with is the idea that as psychologists, as cognitive scientists, even as neuroscientists, we, in some ways, our best approach is to assume that we are only interacting with representations. We are not interacting with the world. So in a sense, what the cognitive scientist needs to do is kind of approach understanding cognition in psychology as if the agent is in a solipsistic world, in a world that is not actually real. We don't need to understand the agent's relationship to the world. We need to understand the agent's relationship to its representation of the world, regardless of whether a real world exists or not. Okay, if you're a psychologist for the Matrix, it doesn't make, you're going to be a psychologist that deals with how Neo interacts with the fake Matrix world, not with the world that's truly out there, which is just full of batteries. People as batteries, right? It's that idea. And so he gives this. So mental states are relations towards representations, and that's really what's critical of this. So this has kind of been something we've been discussing throughout, that really what we're dealing with is, even from the very beginning when we were discussing, I'll get through this, even from the very beginning when we were discussing how, kind of the initial, processes of perception occurred, we were talking about how the brain was manipulating kind of represented aspects of the world and was only dealing with those representations. Okay, that's the entire doctrine of corporeal ideas, the a doctrine of specific nerve energies. All that is the same as this, really. Okay. And he said that when we talk about mental states, we're distinguishing, we can define them by content, what the mental state is, and the mind's or the agent's relationship to the content. And I don't really care that you understand about these details as much as get the big picture here. So this is a true statement for me. I believe that my neighbor is nice, and I absolutely do. He is very nice. He's right next door now. He's so nice. He's probably bringing in my garbage cans even as we speak. We've been very cordial to each other. He's terrific. He's been very easy to work with. I'd let him take care of my doggie. Now, when my kids were younger, I would have let him babysit my kids. Not a problem at all. And what Fodor says is that we've got two pieces here. We've got what's called the intentional relationship, which is what my kind of relationship is with the representation, and the content. What I guess you would say is the actual interpretation of that representation. Okay, there's two separate things, and they both don't have to be true. Because in the computational theory of mind, it doesn't make a difference whether the intentional content is true at all. Okay? To predict my behavior in relationship to my neighbor, it doesn't make a difference whether he's nice, whether he's actually a spy for the Russians. My wife and I have been watching a lot of spy shows recently, and the nicest people turn out to be the spies, as it turns out, right? Because what we're dealing here is with the formality condition. I'm going to go through this a little quickly so we get through it. The formality condition is that the actual things that are being processed and therefore my relationship to the representations really don't have any important, meaningful aspect to them. Processes are symbolic, they are formal, and to best predict my behavior, you need to understand how I am relating to the representations, how the process of perception relates to the representations. The content about whether it's true in the real world, if there is even a real world, and Fodor does believe there's a real world, but he says for all intents and purposes, it doesn't make a difference. To understand the cognition of a person, of an animal, you just need to understand its intentional relation. It's how it's processing these representations, regardless of whether the representations are true or not. So there's no necessary truth value in the representation. What he said, and I think this is a nice way of saying, is the content is opaque. We have, as computational beings, no way of confirming easily during any single process whether what we think is true is true. In fact, my neighbor, as it turns out, was Charlie Manson. No, I'm kidding. He's a wonderful guy, but he could be. And I imagine when you first meet Charlie Manson, and when I guess he's dead now, but when you met him, portrayed in recent movies, he might have seemed like kind of a nice guy, right? And your relationship to him, I guess the Beach Boys were kind of friendly with him, right? They thought he was a cool guy. He kind of had some interesting ideas, but for all intents and purposes, he was a nice guy. And to understand the behavior of the Beach Boys, or to understand my behavior towards my neighbor, it doesn't make a difference. And what Fodor is saying is this is how you need to think of all of cognition. So these are kind of very flamboyant examples about my neighbor and about Charlie Manson and all that stuff. But to understand how computational processes work, how behavior can be predicted even on a perceptual cognitive level, you don't need to understand whether the content of the representations are true, but you only need to understand the agents and the processes relationship to the representations. So mental states, as Fodor suggests, are opaquely construed. They have no access to the outside world. As far as the scientist is concerned, the person, the animal, is interacting with representations. So methodologically, it's kind of like assuming there's a solipsistic world for the computational agent. Okay, and I'm long here, I'm sorry, but if you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. There's papers on this that help with this as well, but I hope you get the idea that what he's saying is to predict behavior, to understand behavior of computational systems, whether they are computers, whether they are people, okay? It doesn't make a difference what's going out in the real world.
That's kind of what I was saying earlier too.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah, I see that now. Very cool. Okay. Great. Well, good luck. I'm happy to answer any questions between now and the time you take the exam. Yeah, that's fine. Just email me or we can set up a Zoom meeting or something like that. Okay? All right. Sorry, I went a little long here. Take care. Good luck.